Welcome to Charleston, South Carolina, in the year 1839. A city balanced uneasily between elegance and unrest, where each cobblestone still remembers the sound of chains, and where one house long vanished from maps continues to cast a shadow across the city's memory. Among the surviving ledgers of the Charleston Police Office, one entry stands out for its brevity. Dated September 14, 1839, it reads only fire, origin unknown. Fire. The column beside it, meant for casualties, is left blank. Yet in the margin, faint written in another hand, appears a single line. The servant woman said the house would not sleep again. No initials, no follow-up report, just that warning suspended between record and superstition. Nearly a century later, the WPA Federal Writers Project gathered thousands of oral histories. One labeled Charleston District 1938 tells of a restless wind and a door that would not stay closed. My great-grandmothers say she heard that knock 3 times at the big door, and when she went, look, the brass handle turn itself. The field worker who wrote those words, Joseph E. Ward, age 29, vanished from the project within 2 years. His last known assignment, Charleston Folklore Survey, 1938. No resignation, no correspondence, no trace. Across multiple archives, the fire dockets, the Freedmen's Bureau files, even late reconstruction. Insurance reports the same phrase recurs, stay until the knock. Historians can't explain its consistency. But in Charleston's oral tradition, that line remains a ritual, a warning, an instruction to hear the spirit pass. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact moment you paused. What did you feel in that silence? The story, now called The Spirit Woman of Charleston, survives through only a handful of traces, scattered across time, like embers that never went cold. They do not form a complete record, but rather a mosaic of fragments, each one fragile, each one uncertain. The earliest piece comes from Charleston City Police Fire Ledger Volume 4, now housed in the South Carolina Historical Society. A heavy leather-bound register whose pages smell faintly of smoke and salt. The entry is dated September 14, 1839. It reads, only fire, origin unknown. The column beside it, reserved for casualties, is left blank. And then in the right-hand margin, written faintly at a slant in another hand entirely, there appears one line and one line only. The servant woman said the house would not sleep again. No initials, no signature, no explanation, no follow-up report. Just those words suspended between record and superstition. When scholars at the Historical Society examined the volume in 2005 using multispectral imaging to preserve the fading ink, they discovered something unexpected. The main text and the marginal note were written with different ink compositions, both iron gall but from separate mixtures. The evidence suggested that the note had been added later, perhaps days later, perhaps by someone who was not the official clerk. The handwriting doesn't match either of the 2 documented clerks for that month, John P. Rourke or Samuel Diaz. Neither left any trace of such language elsewhere in the ledger. Every other entry follows the bureaucratic rhythm of its time, neat columns, no emotion, no poetry. And yet here, this one line breathes differently. It is not record-keeping. It is recollection or warning. The ledger entered the Historical Society's archive in 1924, part of the personal papers of a retired fire marshal. Before that, its path is less certain, but the physical book itself tells its own story. Edges rounded from use, spine repaired with animal glue, page corners rubbed gray from countless hands. There are no missing leaves, no obvious tampering. The handwriting remains steady, except for that single slanted marginal line. A voice without a name. Almost a century later, another document emerges. Not in Charleston, but through the Federal Writers Project under the WPA between 1936 and 1939. Within the South Carolina Slave Narratives collection, one small transcript appears labeled simply, Charleston District 1938. Its file number, SCFWP 1938-0227. 3 short paragraphs typed on onion skin paper, translucent, delicate, the kind of paper that holds a ghost of whatever was pressed beneath it. The informant's name is missing. The interviewers preserved Joseph E. Ward, age 29, born in Sumter County. Ward's assignment to collect oral traditions and spiritual folklore from the coastal lowcountry. His transcript includes a single unforgettable line. "My great-grandmother says she heard that knock 3 times at the big door, and when she went, looked the brass handle turn itself." That line, those 3 knocks, became one of the most discussed images in all Charleston folklore. Ward filed the document. He annotated it in pencil check fire records 1839. And then as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. By 1940, a memo from the state WPA office reads almost coldly, "Contact lost, no forwarding information. No resignation, no correspondence. Just absence." The field worker vanished, leaving behind a fragment about another disappearance. It is coincidence, perhaps, but in the narrative logic of history, coincidence and meaning are rarely separate. What connects the two, the ledger and the WPA file, is not evidence, but persistence. Both describe a house that burned. Both mention a woman without rest. Both contain the word sleep. And both were written by men who disappeared. The archives between those centuries are silent, yet the language repeats. The house would not sleep. The house would not rest. The house that would not sleep again. Archivists call this parallel authenticity, when independent sources confirm the existence of a shared space of memory, but not the event itself. It is as if 2 mirrors face each other, and somewhere between them a reflection keeps walking. The ledger, factual, bureaucratic, impersonal, is an act of containment. The WPA transcript, emotional, remembered, and uncertain, is an act of release. Together they form the coordinates of what historian Ruth Ellen Brooks once called dual historicity. 2 kinds of truth, each incomplete without the other. The ledger's condition is well documented. Stable paper. Bound signatures intact. Ink chemical composition consistent with the late 1830s. Yet within that perfect structure lies the single imperfection that gives it life, that strange marginal line. No administrative purpose, no citation, only testimony. The WPA transcript, too, survives folded, retyped, indexed, and copied across microfilm and digital archives. The informant's voice, anonymous, trembling between folklore and history, became the seed of what would later be called the spirit woman cycle. Each retelling would repeat the same phrases, sometimes altered by accent or region, but always carrying the rhythm of 3 knocks, a rhythm older than the city itself. It is worth pausing here to consider how such fragments endure. Paper lasts because it is stored. Stories last because they are told. Between the 2 lies the fragile bridge of memory, an archivist's hand turning a page, a field worker's pencil noting a phrase, a grandmother's voice whispering it again before sleep. Every scholar who touches these records must choose where to stand, in the realm of evidence or the realm of echo. Each confirms the other even as they refuse to merge. The 1839 ledger gives us a fire, a date, a margin. The 1938 file gives us a voice, a door, a knock. Together they make a dialogue that no single discipline can resolve. What can be said with certainty is this: the documents exist. The handwriting is real. The ink is older than the people who now debate it. The voices are recorded faint, but there. And in that space between paper and breath, between bureaucracy and superstition, a truth lingers patient and unhurried. It neither demands belief nor allows dismissal. It simply waits. Perhaps this is what the note in the margin truly meant. Not that the house would not sleep, but that history itself would not. That somewhere beneath ledgers and plaster and centuries a story was still awake. And like the door it describes, it keeps knocking, quietly, steadily, waiting for someone to listen. In the summer of 1839, Charleston was a city in transition, restless, divided, uneasy, beneath its polished facade. Ships still lined the wharves of East Bay, heavy with cotton and rice, while behind them, in narrow alleys thick with salt air and decay, the voices of the enslaved carried through open windows. The census that year listed over 13,000 enslaved people within city limits, nearly half the population. Their names, when recorded at all, appeared not in ledgers of humanity, but in columns of property. And among those entries, faint, brittle, nearly erased, appears a name: Maria. A woman described as small in frame, 30 years of age, bearing a burn upon the right wrist. The notice ran in the Charleston Courier for 8 consecutive days beginning July 2nd, 1839. It read, "Runaway from the household of Mr. J.B. Henley, a Negro woman named Maria. Known to practice superstitions and suspected of conjure work, $20 reward." Conjure work, a phrase that hovered between accusation and fear. In the polite language of Charleston society, it meant danger of a spiritual kind, the unseen power of those who were never meant to have any power at all. Henley, the householder, was a merchant. His family's name appeared frequently in city records, his signature steady and precise. After the advertisement ceased on July 12th, no follow-up notice appeared. No record of capture, no retraction, just silence. 2 months later, the fire, September 14th, 1839, origin unknown. In the city's fire dockets, the description is bureaucratic, unfeeling. Total loss of dwelling, partial damage to adjoining stable. But then that marginal line. The one we have already read, the servant woman said the house would not sleep again. The phrase hangs like smoke over every attempt at explanation. Somewhere between those two texts, the runaway ad and the fire docket, something happened. Something that no archive has ever been able to pin down. From here, the record fractures, one layer preserved in paper, the other in voice. The first belongs to law, the second to memory. In a Freedmen's Bureau deposition dated 1867, a man named Elias Carter, formerly enslaved in Charleston County, recalled under oath. There was a woman named Maria. She told her master, "This house won't sleep long." 3 days after fire took it. The officer's note in the margin reads simply, "Superstitious statement ignored." Ignored and yet recorded. Dismissed and yet preserved. The paradox at the core of every historical haunting. Carter's statement appears almost 30 years after the fire, yet its phrasing mirrors the language of the 1839 margin. Scholars call such alignment linguistic persistence, when oral repetition maintains structure across generations. To the historian, it is coincidence. To the believer, proof. To the archivist, anomaly. Meanwhile, another file, Charleston Chancery Case number 2746, dated 1840. An insurance dispute, dry and procedural. Among its depositions lies a line of testimony from a neighbor, Robert Mason. The servant, Maria, was seen walking the yard the night prior, carrying a basin of water, murmuring over it. When asked if he believed the act intentional, Mason replied, "She said the fire was already born." Already born. A phrase that chills even now. In the West African cosmologies carried into the Low Country, fire is not mere destruction, it is spirit awakening. To say fire was born was to say that something inevitable had crossed the veil between thought and flame. In court, those words condemned her. In memory, they transfigured her. The official file concludes cause determined accidental. Case closed. But the folklore, it begins there. Across the Gullah Geechee corridor, stories began to circulate of a woman who cursed her master's house. Some said she was beaten, accused of theft, left in the yard to die. Others said she fled, leaving behind a basin of water that steamed through cold. And 3 nights later, the house burned. They say the knock came first, 3 times, slow, measured, like someone asking not to enter but to be remembered. In oral versions collected between 1880 and 1930, the rhythm of the knock varies, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, but always paired with a phrase, "Stay until the knock." Those words appear not just in folklore, but scrawled as marginalia in insurance files, in city ledgers, even in the WPA notes of Joseph Ward. They travel like an echo, looking for its source. Among the earliest musical traces is a spiritual recorded by Harold Corlander in 1937 on John's Island, just outside Charleston. The refrain, "Knock once for mercy, knock twice for sin, knock the 3rd time, let the Lord walk in." No mention of fire or house or woman. And yet the cadence 3 knocks 1 silence aligns perfectly with the Charleston legend. In Gullah belief, the number 3 signifies the crossing between worlds, between wrong and right, between life and memory. The door in the song becomes the threshold between the living and the ancestral. A later ethnographic collection by Mary Alicia Owen, published 1894, includes an account labeled Superstitions from the Carolina Coast. One informant recounts a Charleston woman who curse her massa house till the fire come. The editor dismissed it as reconstruction fancy, but even in rejection the story survived. Dismissal becomes preservation when recorded on paper. Each document denies and yet repeats. Each erasure writes the next verse. By the 1870s, the motif had transformed. In the songs of freed communities, the woman became less vengeful, more guardian than ghost. In one hymn, transcribed at Zion Chapel, Charleston, 1872, the verse reads, 3 knocks for the living one, for the lost. House burned down, soul cross. To sing it was to remember. To remember was to resist silence. The line between folklore and theology thinned until they became indistinguishable. In church hymns, she is the voice that keeps men honest. In conjure tales, she is the fire that tells the truth. In city rumor, she is simply the woman who would not rest. Each version names her differently, but all agree on one thing: the house burned and the knocking never stopped. Between these retellings runs the cold current of bureaucracy. The Charleston Fire Relief Board in 1847 issued a circular cautioning against false tales of cursed dwellings. The tone defensive. The language almost frightened. False tales is their term for folklore that refuses to die. The official city tried to extinguish what the people called memory. And yet 30 years later, freed people interviewed by bureau agents told the same story, not as ghost, but as justice. One account from 1866, recorded by Benjamin Holmes, reads, "She knock for them what ain't got no voice. Knock till they hear." The agent noted in parentheses, superstition. But to Holmes and his generation, the knocking was not superstition, it was testimony. A rhythm of accountability in a world built on silence. The folklore layer passed mouth to mouth, adapted with time, becoming parable, hymn, dream, warning. Some claimed to hear the knocking only on nights of thunder. Others said it came with still air when even the magnolia leaves would not move. In the WPA files, one informant told Ward, "That woman ain't no ghost. She a memory what walk back." A sentence so plain yet profound, a philosophy disguised as a folktale. The folklore remembers what the record forgets. The record preserves what the folklore cannot prove. Together they form the song of two truths, each incomplete, yet resonant when heard together. By the late 19th century, Charleston's elite dismissed the legend as Negro superstition. Yet quietly in the alleys and the quarters, people still left bowls of water by their doors, a gesture against fire, or perhaps an offering to the woman who had once carried one. Even skeptics would mutter, before blowing out their lamps, "Let the house sleep." That phrase meant as comfort carried irony, because the legend insists the house never did. In archives today, the documents lie only inches apart. The ledger that recorded the fire, the advertisement that named Mariah, the deposition that ignored her words, and the song, anonymous, ancient, echoing through shellac recordings, still whispering her presence. They do not confirm one another, but they rhyme. And that rhyme, that pulse of repetition, is the heartbeat of survival. The historian can measure ink and handwriting, but not the tremor of fear behind a line. The folklorist can trace motifs and patterns, but not the quiet ache that makes a story worth retelling. Somewhere between those disciplines, between the ledger's cold precision and the hymn's trembling faith, Mariah still stands. A woman once accused of conjure, now conjuring remembrance itself. She is the only one in Charleston's archives who never signs her name, and yet she has outlived every man who did. And if you listen carefully in the rustle of those papers, or the static of those recordings, you can still hear it. 3 soft knocks, deliberate, even, as if history itself were asking permission to enter again. By the spring of 1840, Charleston had almost forgotten. The ashes swept the street, rebuilt, the merchants gone back to counting ships and sugar. But a city never truly forgets what it tries hardest to erase. It buries it, rearranges it, renames. And beneath that quiet, the fault lines of memory keep shifting. The official report of the fire, copied into the municipal records of 1840, declares simply, "Cause presumed accidental. No remains found." 2 lines sufficient for bureaucracy, yet empty of everything human. It is as if the city had decided that silence itself could act as closure. But silence in Charleston never lasts long. That same year, letters began to appear in the archives of the Charleston Mercury, unsigned, written in a careful, almost clerical hand. Each described the same unease, a knocking sound heard near Meeting Street on windless nights. Some claimed it was pipes in the rebuilt foundation. Others said rats. But one letter ends with a sentence that seems too precise for metaphor. I counted 3, then nothing. It was not animal nor man. It was memory. The editor printed none of these. He filed them away. Their pages still exist, folded and yellowed, their ink faded to the color of seawater. In 1842, a property transaction appears in the county index, the sale of the burned lot to a merchant named Jonathan Hale, who rebuilt on the same foundation. His insurance file, preserved in Charleston Fire Atlas Series 1854, lists his home as rebuilt dwelling structure uncertain. But in the lower margin of that document, again another note appears. In a different hand, in lighter ink. Advised not to rebuild. House restless. The handwriting does not belong to the inspector, nor to Hale. It is unsigned. Just as before, Hale's letters now stored in a private collection. Mention recurring small fires in the kitchen chimney. Nothing serious. Nothing unexplainable. Yet he writes, "Each time the flames go out, I hear the sound again, slow, deliberate, as though something is taking attendance." The rhythm of that confession feels familiar. 3 knocks, 1 pause. The same cadence passed from mouth to mouth, from paper to paper, as if the house itself were reciting its own history. Meanwhile, in the city's oral circles, the story evolves. By 1850, the woman with the burned hand had become both villain and saint, depending on who told it. In the quarters, her name was spoken softly, as if summoning would invite her. They called her Mother Fire. Children were warned, "Don't lie to Mother Fire. She hear you through the wall." Among enslaved elders, she became protector, the spirit who punished cruelty, who burned deceit. In parlors uptown, she was the curse itself, a warning whispered behind fans. Every retelling rewrote the balance of guilt and grace. One recorded sermon from 1856 at Zion Church contains a line that startled even its white observers: "When the master sin, the fire no." No mention of Mariah, no names at all. But the congregation answered with rhythm, clapping softly as though the fire itself were listening. To outsiders, it sounded like song. To insiders, it was remembrance. Every verse was code. Every amen an archive. As the Civil War drew near, Charleston's spiritual geography thickened with memory. The same street that once burned became a site of warning. Soldiers bivouacked nearby reported doors opening on their own. In 1863, a Union prisoner, writing from Charleston jail, noted in his diary, "The locals speak of a house where the wind never rests. They say it's haunted by a woman wronged. I cannot say, but even the guards cross themselves when we march past." He records the superstition with amusement, and yet admits he too began to count the knocks at night. After the war, Reconstruction brought new bureaucrats, new ledgers, new words, but the story too adapted to new languages. The Freedmen's Bureau reports from 1867 to 1869 mention rumors of cursed dwellings near the Meeting Street district. One officer writes, "Many freed laborers refuse to work in the newly erected homes upon that site, claiming they hear rapping sounds in the wall." His conclusion: psychological residue of servitude. But between the lines, the truth hums like a low drum, what the record calls psychological, the people called witness. In 1870, a hymn appeared in a small pamphlet printed for the Zion Chapel Choir titled, "The House Won't Sleep No More." Its lyrics: "Fire take the bed, wind take the door, Lord take the sorrow, but the soul come ashore." The melody is simple, almost circular, its refrain repeating until the final line dissolves into hum. For decades, scholars dismissed it as local superstition turned into hymn. But to those who sang it, it was not about a house, it was about freedom. The house stood for the system that enslaved them, the fire for the reckoning that would come, the knocking for the persistence of truth that would not die. By 1884, the Charleston News printed a short piece titled, "Strange Tales from the Old Quarter." It described in genteel phrasing a certain dwelling whose occupants claim nocturnal disturbances. The tone is mocking, but one sentence lingers. The current mistress of the home insists that the knocking follows her name, as if called from beneath the floor. The article ends without comment, and yet the very act of publication marks the legend's return to public life. From oral story to print again, as though the fire had found a new language. At the same time, an anthropologist named Charles Colcock Jones began compiling Negro myths from the Georgia coast. Among them, a version of the Charleston fire. But now the spirit woman is unnamed. She is the servant who warned the house. Her voice comes not from vengeance, but from justice deferred. Jones concludes dryly, "It is a moral tale warning against cruelty." He reduces the story to lesson, and in doing so ensures its survival. Because even in condescension, it is written again. The pen mocking the ghost becomes its next medium. By the end of the 19th century, 3 separate layers had formed the legal record unyielding, the folklore breathing, and the hybrid, the new myth, half scholarly, half sacred. In the parlors of Charleston's white elite, she was a curiosity. In the songs of the Gullah Coast, a guide. In the files of historians, a question mark that refused to fade. The bureau agents who once dismissed superstitious testimony had unwittingly preserved the only surviving evidence that those voices existed. Each dismissal became a record, each record a doorway. In 1891, a minister named Reverend Samuel Logan transcribed a sermon titled, "When the Walls Remember." His account reads, "They built a house where injustice stood, and the walls began to speak. The white folks call it haunting. We call it history." That line, unpolished profound, would later appear again in WPA transcripts of the 1930s word for word, as if carried mouth to mouth for half a century. Or perhaps page to page. The echo moves both ways. Throughout these decades, the city's foundations shifted. Streets widened, structures demolished. But beneath the asphalt and archive, the same rhythm pulsed 3 knocks, 1 silence. A code of endurance, a heartbeat in the architecture. Folklore began to merge with geography. The Meeting Street site was mapped in guidebooks as haunted, its legend absorbed into Charleston's reputation for ghost stories. Tourists sought entertainment. Locals sought remembrance. And in that uneasy balance, the story adapted once more, becoming both warning and commodity. Yet the core remained unchanged. A woman wronged a fire, unexplained, a city still listening to its own silence. By the early 1900s, the spiritual meaning of the knocking had deepened. In Gullah cosmology, the sound of 3 taps was interpreted as a call to truth, a reminder to speak what had been hidden. Children were told, if you lie near that house, the walls will tell on you. What began as a tale of vengeance had become an ethical compass. The fire purified, the knock corrected. Even those who no longer believed in spirits still lowered their voices when they passed Meeting Street at night. Belief, like smoke, lingered after flame. Fact and folklore had by now woven themselves so tightly that no historian could pull one thread without unraveling the other. Each document found a twin in a story. Each story found proof in a document. Together they built a rhythm, the slow ascent of an unresolved truth. The legend had reached its rising point, not a climax of revelation, but of repetition. Because repetition in the language of history is revelation. The more a story returns, the more it refuses to die. By the dawn of the 20th century, Charleston's archives were heavy with ghosts, not the kind that moan in hallways, but those that write in margins, that hum in old songs that tap against glass when the wind has gone still. The city called it folklore. The descendants called it memory. The historians called it data. And the woman unnamed, unseen, unforgotten called it justice. When the smoke of Reconstruction settled, Charleston became a city layered with aftermath, the ruins of a war, the weight of unspoken names. Its streets had changed, but not its silences. Where once stood the burned dwelling of Meeting Street, new brick, rose neat, respectable, carefully distanced from the rumor of what came before. But silence never stays buried in Charleston. It resettles like dust until a hand disturbs it again. The new residents of the district, merchants and clerks from upstate, began reporting strange patterns, shutters that opened without wind lamps that swayed when air stood still. Their letters stored in the Charleston Historical Commission describe not terror, but fatigue. One line reads, "We cannot rest. The house creaks as though remembering." Another, written by a tenant in 1872, says, "Each night a sound like knocking, patient, almost courteous, as if awaiting acknowledgement." The phrasing echoes an older tongue, one that predates their ownership. The language of respect or warning. By then, the story of Mariah, or the servant woman who cursed her master's house, had already re-entered circulation through song. In the freed people's churches along the coast, her name appeared between verses whispered, never spoken from the pulpit. In one hymn transcribed by missionary Samuel Logan at Zion Chapel, the refrain endures. 3 knocks for the living one, for the lost. House burned down, spirit cross. It was a rhythm of faith disguised as superstition, a theology hidden inside a ghost story. When the congregation sang, the fire became metaphor, not destruction, but justice deferred. From the state's Bureau archives, a single correspondence from 1875 reveals how the legend began to intersect with bureaucracy again. Written by field agent H.B. Nesbitt, it reads, "Several laborers refuse to occupy dwellings erected upon the old Meeting Street lot. They claim it is unclean ground, that a woman's spirit guards it against cruelty. Efforts to persuade them otherwise have failed." His tone is practical, but beneath the ink fatigue shows. Charleston was a city of ghosts, bureaucratic, moral, human. For every house that stood 1,000 remained unbuilt, not because of ruin, but because memory refused permission. The city government responded by declaring such tales cultural residue. Yet in that phrase, residue, lies confession, the acknowledgement that something remains. Through the 1880s and 1890s, the oral versions multiplied. Children were told, "If you knock 3 times, she answers. But if you run, she follows." To the young, it was a dare. To the old, a prayer. And while official historians reduce the event to local legend, the descendants of those who once served in the district began keeping their own oral records, small notebooks, family Bibles, margins filled with phrases. "Don't rebuild where she burned. Water before fire. 3 is her number." These notes, mundane and devotional, became the real folklore archive, invisible to the state, but enduring through memory. Meanwhile, in the legal files of the Charleston Fire Relief Board, a curious entry appears dated 1893. Recurrent ignition at former site of Meeting Street dwelling. No apparent cause. Local residents refer to phenomenon as the visitation. No further explanation. No scientific follow-up. The phrasing alone, the visitation, marks a shift, the language of administration infected by belief. Where once the state wrote accident, it now wrote visitation. Even the most skeptical clerks could not help but echo the city's heartbeat. By 1900, the story had entered its reflective phase. The living no longer feared the spirit. They used her as warning, as parable. Mothers hushed their children with her name. "Don't raise your voice, or she'll hear the lie." Laborers paused before hammering new beams, murmuring a single line. "Let the house sleep this time." But the house, or perhaps the memory never did. In 1911, preservationist Edward McCready photographed the remnants of a brick foundation on the same block. His notes read, "Local reports connect this with the 1839 fire. Workers refuse to dig after dark. One claims to hear a woman calling names he does not know. The photo itself, grainy bleached, shows nothing but shadow. Yet even the photograph participates in the pattern to document, is to prolong. Every act of recording extends the haunting." That same year, a newspaper column titled "Echoes of the Old City" recounted the fire as a moral fable of pride and retribution. The journalist never mentioned slavery, nor Mariah, nor cruelty, only a woman's curse. But the omission speaks louder than inclusion. By stripping her of context, they made her eternal. The city had found a way to believe without confessing why. Folklore, like smoke, adapts to containment. When written history narrowed its gaze, the oral tradition widened. In 1922, folklorist Mary Granger recorded a hymn on John's Island titled, "The Iron Door Done Sing." Its refrain, "Don't open the safe, Lord, till the truth come in." Scholars debate its origin, but the imagery iron door truth mirrors the legend of Mariah's fire, where even the safe melted. The song became a code for endurance. The truth will enter when the house is ready. Each recording, each page was another repetition of the same ritual history, calling itself back to attention. By the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project began documenting African American folklore across the South. Among its field workers was Joseph E. Ward, 29 years old, assigned to the Charleston district. Ward's surviving notes, now brittle onion-skin paper, include one titled, "House That Would Not Sleep." He describes an elderly woman, anonymous, speaking in a blend of English and Gullah. Her voice, he writes, rose like tidewater, soft, then sure. Her story began with a warning, "Don't leave before the knock." Ward transcribed it phonetically, line by line, careful not to interpret. Then the page ends mid-sentence. No continuation, no carbon copy. The next numbered page in his file is missing. The WPA editors later annotated, "Incomplete interview, check fire records, 1839. But Ward's personal diary, discovered decades later in a family attic, contains a line dated June 1938, "Stayed 2 nights on Meeting Street. Heard nothing the first. The second, I thought I heard it slow, deliberate 3 knocks. He underlined the phrase twice, then stopped writing. 2 years later, his name vanished from the project roster. Official explanation, contact lost. His absence became part of the legend. Another disappearance folded into the archive. In the years that followed, scholars argued over coincidence and continuity. Was Ward's missing page mere accident? Was the sound he heard imagination or inheritance? Every discipline answers differently. Historians call it error. Folklorists call it persistence. But the people who lived near Meeting Street had no such distinction. To them, the spirit woman was neither ghost nor myth. She was memory made audible. A WPA informant named Clara Simmons, aged 89, explained it best. "That woman done told her master, 'When you call my name 3 times, the wall will answer.' That's how come they hear it. The wall calling back." Ward's handwritten note beneath her statement reads, "Possibly connected to earlier account. Verify with city files." Even skepticism keeps the echo alive. To question her is to repeat her. By the mid-20th century, the boundaries between archive and folklore had dissolved completely. Tour guides told her story as haunted Charleston. Historians cited her as example of syncretic superstition. But beneath both, the same rhythm endured. 3 knocks, 1 pause, a silence that feels like listening. When the South Carolina Historical Society digitized its ledgers in the 1970s, the entry for the 1839 fire was scanned anew. Under ultraviolet light, the marginal note. The servant woman said, "The house would not sleep again," gleamed brighter than the rest of the ink. Technicians called it a chemical quirk. Locals called it proof. The ghost had adapted to technology, a digital haunting. That same decade, historian Ruth Ellen Brooks revisited the files. Her dissertation draft ends with the sentence, "In Charleston, some fires refuse to go out, they change form." It could be metaphor. It could be observation. But her margin note beneath it reads only, "Still knocking." Fact and folklore now stood face to face, mirror and reflection. The documents did not confirm the haunting. The haunting confirmed the documents. Between them, a dialogue unfolded across centuries, the clerk writing, the singer answering. The bureaucrat closing a file, the storyteller opening it again. This is the rhythm of endurance, the pulse of memory disguised as superstition, the theology of survival disguised as ghost story. Every retelling resurrects her, and every silence invites her return. By the end of the 1930s, when the WPA project closed, the phrase, "Stay until the knock," had appeared in 5 separate transcripts, different counties, different voices, same wording. No one claimed authorship. It was as if the phrase had entered the collective bloodstream. No longer a legend, a ritual. To stand before those archives today is to sense both presences, the factual and the folkloric, weaving together like threads of smoke. The record says fire. The memory says justice. The record says silence. The folklore says sound. And somewhere between those opposites lies the truth that remembrance, like fire, consumes and creates at once. Mariah's servant, fugitive prophet, left behind no grave, no signature, no descendant to claim her name. But she left rhythm. 3 knocks, 1 pause, enough to summon centuries. Each historian who opens the ledger, each reader who breathes between sentences, joins the same pattern, a participation in her persistence. The record will outlast the voice, but the voice will outlast belief. Between them, the house endures. And it still will not sleep. By the time the last WPA field office closed its doors, the files of Charleston's folklore division had been boxed, sealed, and labeled for shipment. One of those boxes, File Group 1938C, carried a loose envelope marked in pencil ward incomplete. Inside, only a single sheet remained. Typed on thin onion skin paper, its top half contains a fragment, no date, no title. It reads, "She say if you wait long enough, the house breathe different, like somebody remembering." Then, nothing. The rest of the page is blank. Not torn, not faded. Just blank, as if the typewriter had stopped mid-thought, the air refusing another word. That silence became the bridge between the living and the recorded, between the investigator and the investigated, between history and the thing that refuses to die inside it. Charleston, 1939. Summer heat, thick as ash. Ward was last seen leaving a boarding house near East Bay, carrying his satchel and a notebook. He told the innkeeper he would spend one more night near Meeting Street. No one saw him return. The following morning, his room remained undisturbed. The bed unmade, the lamp still burning. On the table, a single scrap of paper. A note, only 2 words. Heard it. The handwriting as his nervous hurried, the ink pressed deep. Investigators later dismissed the detail as coincidence, perhaps the start of an unrelated draft. But in the folklore archive, coincidence is never innocent. It is continuity, the unseen hand, turning the next page. In the decades that followed, Ward's disappearance took on its own afterlife. Folklorists debated whether he became part of the very myth he studied. Historians more cautious called it occupational hazard. But the old people of Charleston had a simpler explanation. They said he stayed till the knock. That phrase, passed now through almost 2 centuries, is no longer warning. It is invocation. Stay until the knock. Stay until history answers itself. Stay until silence speaks. Every retelling returns to that moment, the point where evidence ends and echo begins. The bridge between what is written and what is felt. Archival silence is not absence. It is tension. A held breath between sentences. When a record stops, the imagination begins to hum, trying to fill the space where language collapsed. That hum is where the spirit woman lives now, not in fire, not in wall, but in the unsaid. At the South Carolina Historical Society, the 1839 fire ledger sits under glass, its ink brown with oxidation, its edges ragged with age. Visitors approach quietly. They lower their heads as though standing before a grave. And when they read the margin, the servant woman said the house would not sleep again. Most do not speak. But a few tap the glass. Once, twice, thrice, and step back. It is not superstition. It is dialogue. A small wordless acknowledgement that the past still knocks. Across the city in a basement of the College of Charleston sits a phonograph record label worn, title half erased, The House That Would Not Sleep, Charleston, 1937. The voice on the recording is faint, the accent gullah, the tone almost melodic. A woman speaks. She don't mean no harm. She just want the truth to walk. Then a pause. Then a soft tapping sound in the background. 3 in sequence. Archivists later noted it as static anomaly. But in the long reel of Southern folklore, static has always been another name for breath. In one of his last surviving notes, folklorist Ruth Ellen Brooks wrote of that recording. It is difficult to tell whether the sound precedes the voice or follows it. In either case, it seems to answer. Her handwriting trails into ellipses, 3 dots that mirror the knocks themselves. Even punctuation becomes ritual. 3 marks. 1 silence. That rhythm repeats everywhere in the songs, the ledgers, the testimonies, the heartbeats of the city that keeps remembering what it cannot prove. At the Charleston Municipal Archive, a newer annotation was added to the microfilm version of the 1839 report. See also WPA Collection Folklore, SC 227, related oral narrative. Bureaucracy centuries later now cross-references belief. Fact and folklore have begun to cite each other. The archive itself haunted by its own indexes. When you follow those references, the trail narrows to one final convergence, a late entry in the Charleston Evening Post, 1941. Headline: Former WPA worker dies in obscurity. The obituary makes no mention of Ward, only initials JEW, found in notes related to local superstition. The paper records no cause of death, no burial, just another administrative full stop. But for those who've read enough of these endings, the full stop never means finish, it means fade. The deeper you go into the archives, the more the language begins to echo itself. In the early fire reports, origin unknown. In the insurance claims house, restless. In the oral accounts, she won't rest. The phrasing mutates, but the tone remains the pulse of something unresolved, writing itself through every century. Each clerk who copied the report, each archivist who cataloged the entry, became part of the same long confession that what they were describing was not destruction, but continuation. The fire ended nothing. It began the record. Every document since 1839 has been an act of repetition. The handwriting may change, the ink may fade, but the voice returns. In this sense, haunting is just history insisting on its own afterlife. The spirit woman is not apparition. She is the memory of injustice made self-aware. She does not walk through walls. She walks through words. When the people of Charleston say they hear her knocking, what they mean is they hear the sound of their own omissions. They hear what the archive could not bear to say aloud. By the time the 20th century entered its war years, Charleston's ghost tours had already commodified her name. A story told for tourists, stripped of context, recited under gaslight. But beneath the theater, the rhythm persisted. 3 knocks, 1 pause. The city's conscience disguised as folklore. A child who hears it may laugh. A scholar may write it down. A survivor or descendant may close their eyes and whisper back, "I know." That whisper is the true climax, the point where belief becomes understanding and understanding becomes inheritance. The deep bridge of this story is not the moment of fire, it is the moment of recognition. When the listener realizes that every ledger, every testimony, every song was never about the supernatural, but about survival. The knocking was not vengeance. It was insistence. Insistence that no erasure is ever complete. insistence that the oppressed will speak, even if only through rhythm or breath or pause, and so when the final WPA transcript stops mid-sentence, it does not fail. It fulfills the prophecy, because the story began with a line half-written in a police ledger and ends with a line half-written in a federal report. Full circle. Two fragments facing each other across a century. On the last page of her research notebook, historian Brooks wrote, "Every historian who closes this file joins its silence." Below that line, she drew 3 short dashes, then nothing. Her colleague later found that she had been using the same notebook to record heart murmurs from her medical studies. The last 3 marks, meant as pulse readings, had become a symbol, the heartbeat of the forgotten. To hear the story aloud in full is to hear that rhythm take shape. The opening line of the record said, "The servant woman said the house would not sleep again." Now in the deep bridge, the archive itself cannot sleep. The files whisper, the microfilm hums. The sound engineers hear tapping through static. The librarians tap back just to check. And still the pattern continues. 3 knocks, 1 pause, as if the city is keeping time with itself. In every era, there are those who try to end the legend, to tidy the record, to explain away coincidence. But the closer they come to closure, the louder the echo grows. It is not defiance. It is completion denied. The spirit woman remains not to punish but to remind, to ensure that Charleston never again mistakes silence for peace. At the university archive, a curator once said quietly to a researcher, "You can't study her. You can only join the conversation." Perhaps that is what Ward did. Perhaps that is what all of us do when we listen too closely. The historian becomes participant. The record becomes ritual. So when the sound comes, if it comes, don't fear it. Don't flee. Wait. Listen. Count the rhythm. 3 soft knocks. 1 pause. It is the past asking not for belief but for acknowledgement. Maybe it was never about haunting. Maybe it was always about hearing. Because when a story outlives every witness, when a fire leaves only echoes, when the dead are remembered, not by name, but by noise, then history itself has crossed over. And somewhere in that crossing between evidence and silence, between record and reverence, the woman still stands. Her hand raised, her voice gone, her message clear. Stay until the knock. Today the house no longer stands. The lot once listed as Meeting Street number 112 has been paved, repaved, and repurposed. What was once a 2-story dwelling is now a section of municipal parking flat. Concrete white lines, magnolia trees planted to soften memory. Beneath them, the soil still holds fragments, charred brick iron nails fused by heat glass, melted into strange translucence. Each time a maintenance crew uncovers these remains, an archivist is called to verify. And each time the report concludes the same way, no definitive evidence of origin. The phrase repeats the first record's uncertainty, proof that the house, even gone, continues to resist closure. The fire of 1839 is no longer tragedy or legend. It has become a pattern of documentation, of forgetting, of rediscovery. Every few decades, someone stumbles upon the same line, the same handwriting, the same question. Who wrote those words? Why did they linger? The Charleston Fire Ledger Volume 4 rests today in climate-controlled storage at the South Carolina Historical Society. The Freedmen's Bureau case file, SC-1118A, sits in Washington. The WPA transcript, SC-FWP 1938-0227, remains in the Library of Congress. Each item preserved, cataloged, digitized. Each existing in separate institutions, unaware that they describe the same heartbeat. To scholars, these are records of incomplete evidence. To the community, they are fragments of faith. Between them lies the gulf that defines all historical study, the space between evidence and meaning. Every attempt to bridge it becomes an act of translation. Every translation a kind of prayer. When historians revisit these files, they find no resolution, only recurrence. The ink analysis confirms age but not authorship. The handwriting experts disagree. The maps misalign. The oral testimonies contradict. And yet, Every layer converges upon the same silence. It is not a vacuum, it is a hum. Something continues beneath the paperwork, an awareness patient and steady waiting to be heard. Archivist Sandra Lee, who scanned the ledger in 2005, described an error in the digital image. The text appeared twice, once in original ink, once faintly below it, a spectral duplication. She printed the faulty page, kept it pinned to her wall. It looked, she said later, like the document was knocking back. A technical glitch, perhaps? Or just the archive performing its oldest function, echoing itself. What remains of the people of Moriah? There is nothing beyond the advertisement, the accusation, and the rumor of her words. No grave, no census record, no obituary. And yet she endures precisely because she was never allowed to conclude. Erasure became endurance. Absence became agency. Of her master Henley, a few ledgers survived: debt accounts, trade receipts, an unfinished letter to his insurer. The last line reads, "If any should ask, tell them the house itself desired to burn." Then the handwriting stops. Even in confession, he cannot name her. But she is there in the syntax, in the fear of personifying the house, in the refusal to say her name aloud. History hides its conscience in metaphors. The folklore reads them plainly. Of Joseph E. Ward, the WPA collector who followed her echoes into the 1930s, there remains no confirmed grave. No marriage certificate, no death record. Just a note in the Federal Ledger. Contact lost, 1940. His disappearance completes the circle of incompletion. One scribe in 1839, another in 1938. Both vanish into the same silence, both leave behind a half sentence. The servant woman said the house would not sleep again. She say if you wait long enough, the house breathe different. Two records a century apart, sharing cadence, breath, rhythm. In that mirroring, the story finds its structure. What history calls coincidence, memory calls return. Over time, the spirit woman's legend has shifted tone. In the 19th century, she was vengeance. In the Reconstruction years, witness. In the 20th, symbol. And now she is metaphor for remembrance itself. Her knocks have become the way Charleston measures its conscience, each retelling another pulse of accountability. During a 2019 symposium at the Avery Research Center, historian Bernice Singleton concluded her lecture with the line, "If you listen long enough, history breathes. Sometimes it knocks." The audience did not applaud. They waited. For a moment, the room was completely still. That pause, the one before clapping, felt like answer. In museums and classrooms, the spirit woman of Charleston is presented today not as ghost, but as pattern. A model for how trauma survives documentation. A case study in what scholars now call the ethics of incompletion. Her story teaches that the archive is not merely a container of facts. It is an instrument that remembers emotion long after the words fade. When a document refuses to resolve it, means the subject still has something left to say. The preservation of these records depends on funds, on humidity, on power. Yet their endurance depends on something less measurable, the willingness to believe that history speaks through repetition. Each time a curator reads the margin, the story wakes. Each time a student retypes the words, the rhythm restarts. Even digitization, the modern ritual of scanning and labeling, becomes an act of resurrection. The past enters light again, pixel by pixel. The spirit woman's name, if it was ever truly Moriah, has long escaped the bureaucratic index. But her essence lives in the cultural patterns that outlasted her, in the triple knock of spirituals sung on John's Island, in the iron door imagery of Gullah hymns, in the small bowls of water still left by certain doorsteps, in the low-country tokens of cooling, of cleansing, of respect. What began as fear has become custom. What began as curse has become conscience. Charleston's modern identity, built upon tourism and restoration, often trades in its own ghosts. But the story of this woman, her fire, her vow, remains singular. It asks for no spectacle, only attention, only acknowledgement that silence can testify. Among the private collections of the University of South Carolina lies a folder labeled Brooks Papers, 1973 to 1984. Inside her last handwritten note, she will not sleep until we name her. No one has. Perhaps that is the point. By remaining unnamed, she resists ownership. She belongs not to one lineage or narrative, but to everyone who has ever been erased and still insists on return. Each era finds her again under different guises in different tongues and calls the encounter coincidence. But she knows her own schedule. Every century, one more archivist listens. The deeper lesson of this case, beyond the fire, beyond the myth, is that the archive itself is a living entity. It absorbs what is asked of it. It forgets according to the manners of its keepers. It awakens when read aloud. The spirit woman's persistence proves that documentation, when mixed with devotion, becomes ritual. Each scholar who opens the file participates in that ritual unknowingly. To study her is to keep her alive. Perhaps that is why the legend still circulates not through fear, but through affection. Among Charleston's elders, she is not the ghost of vengeance, but the lady who listens. They say if you speak truth near the site, the air feels lighter. If you lie, it grows thick. The city, even in its modern skyline, still obeys the rhythm of that unseen correction. What remains then is not proof, but pattern. The first fire ledger, the last transcript, the faint echo between them. All incomplete, all essential. Each generation adds a layer, another annotation, another footnote, another knock. The story refuses to conclude because its subject was never allowed an ending. In a recent digital restoration project, technicians discovered that the spectral duplicate on the scanned page, the one Sandra Lee once described, aligns perfectly with the rhythm of the legend. 3 ghost lines, 1 space. An accidental harmony between machine and myth. They kept the error. They called it preservation artifact. Perhaps it is more than that. Perhaps it is proof that technology too can remember rhythm. To walk down Meeting Street now is to feel the convergence of centuries. The buildings gleam, the pavements hum with traffic. Tourists pass by unaware of what lies beneath their feet. Yet locals still say quietly that some nights when the air is heavy and the bells from St. Michael's ring late, you can hear a faint sound echo between the walls. Not quite echo, not quite memory. A small, deliberate sequence. 3 knocks, 1 pause. No one claims to know its source. Some say it's pipes, some say wind, some say her. But the city listens anyway, because listening at last is how Charleston prays. Every documentary must end, but this one cannot conclude. To finish would be to silence what was never quiet. So instead, we leave it open, an unfinished cadence. A ledger without closure. A story that loops back on itself until the listener becomes witness. Maybe she didn't disappear. Maybe we did. Maybe the fire was never punishment, but memory finding form. Maybe haunting is just the conscience of history returning for another reading. And if after this voice fades, you hear something in the quiet, a soft, patient rhythm against the edge of silence, don't turn away. That's her. Still here. Still keeping time. Still waiting for us to listen. Stay until the knock.